Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a can of soup from the grocery store. The prosecutor said flatly, not bothering to look up. The man in question, thin, gray-bearded, his jacket torn at the sleeves, didn't raise his head. I just needed enough to make it through one more night, he whispered. A few in the courtroom shifted in their seats, one even scoffed under their breath. But the judge didn't move. He stared at the file in front of him, fingers tightening around the pages. His eyes paused on the name Raymond Cole. Then something changed. The judge's jaw tensed. His hand trembled. And slowly, he stood. The room fell silent. Who was this man in handcuffs? And why did the judge suddenly look like he was staring at a ghost from the battlefield? The sun had just begun to sink behind the desert hills, casting long, tired shadows across the cracked pavement of Tucson, Arizona. Behind a shuttered gas station on the edge of town, surrounded by rusting metal, broken glass, and faded graffiti, an old man stirred beneath a weather-stained tarp. His name was Raymond Cole, and he had slept in that same corner for nearly 3 months now. 67 years old, with a thick graying beard and a face like worn leather, Raymond looked like a man time had forgotten. His coat was too big for his shrinking frame. His boots, army issue from decades ago, were split at the soles. But he walked as if the weight on his shoulders wasn't from hunger or age, it was from memory. Each night before curling beneath his tarp, Raymond would pull from his shirt pocket a small brass Zippo lighter, scratched and dented, but still gleaming beneath the grime. On one side was the U.S. Army insignia, on the other, a faintly etched phrase, "Keep moving forward." He never used it. He didn't smoke. But he'd flip it open and shut, staring into the flicker of desert moonlight reflecting off the steel, as if trying to see a different life in its flame. For 4 days, Raymond hadn't eaten. Not that he hadn't tried. He had walked the alleys behind diners, hoping for tossed scraps, checked trash bins behind convenience stores. But luck, it seemed, had moved on without him. That morning, as hunger gnawed deeper into his chest, Raymond passed the corner grocery store on Valencia Avenue. It was small, family-owned, known for its fresh tortillas and community bulletin board. Inside, the air was cool and the shelves were stocked with brightly colored cans and boxes, little luxuries just out of reach. He hesitated at the door, hand resting against the frame. His pride had always been the last thing he let go of. But hunger doesn't negotiate. Inside, he moved quietly, respectfully. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't beg. He simply wandered until he reached the back row where canned goods lined the shelves in neat rows. His hand hovered, then settled on a single can of chicken noodle soup store brand. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat and turned to leave Headlow eyes empty. But the young cashier had been watching him on the store's overhead mirror system. "Hey," the boy shouted. "Stop right there," Raymond did. He didn't run. He didn't lie. He just stood still, like a man accepting what he'd already accepted long ago. By the time the police arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside the store, mostly regulars and bystanders, curious about the commotion. 2 patrol officers stepped out of the cruiser, Officer Daniels, a gruff veteran of the force, and Officer Rivera, fresh out of the academy. "Step away from the building," Daniels said. Raymond complied without protest. The soup can was still in his coat. His wrists went behind his back easily, too easily. They were thinner than most men's ankles. As Rivera tightened the cuffs, he noticed something dangling from Raymond's neck, a pair of dog tags, old and worn, the print almost rubbed away. "You a vet?" Rivera asked, softer than before. Raymond didn't look up. "Used to be someone useful," he muttered. "Not anymore." At the precinct, Raymond sat in silence while a tired public defender gave him 10 minutes of attention. He nodded politely, signed the form, and said thank you. No calls were made. No one was waiting. No one would come. On the booking form under next of kin, he left the line blank. As the sun dipped fully behind the mountains, the holding cell filled with shadows. Raymond sat with his back to the wall, eyes closed, whispering under his breath, "Just one more night, Maggie. Just one more." No one knew who Maggie was. No one asked. Outside, life went on. Cars honked, neon signs flickered, people argued about gas prices and weekend plans. But inside that holding cell sat a man with no one from nowhere who once served a nation that now walked past him every day without seeing him at all. And in the morning, he'd be standing in front of a judge, accused of theft, defended by no one, forgotten by everyone. Except the truth had just started to stir. The courtroom moved like a slow machine, gears grinding through petty cases. traffic violations, and tired defendants who barely made eye contact. The walls, once polished oak, now dulled by years of routine, bore silent witness to the same cycle every day. It was the kind of place where no one expected anything remarkable to happen until they called his name. Case 71403, State of Arizona versus Raymond Cole, the clerk said without inflection. Heads barely turned. Just another vagrant, just another charge. Raymond was let in wearing the same frayed coat he'd been arrested in. His beard looked untouched since winter, and his sunken eyes showed a man more accustomed to sleeping near dumpsters than under roofs. His hands were cuffed in front of him, not because he posed a threat, but because policy said he had to be. He shuffled to the defense table, where a young, distracted public defender gave him a barely perceptible nod. "Just plead guilty, Mr. Cole. First-time theft. You'll be out by next week." Raymond didn't respond. He simply sat still and silent, like a man waiting to be forgotten. Up on the bench sat Judge Michael Lane, a seasoned figure in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of stare that discouraged small talk. He wasn't cruel, but he was strict, known for moving fast through the docket and not tolerating excuses. The prosecutor, a young man too eager for his own good, stood confidently and began. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught on surveillance stealing a can of soup from a local grocer. He has no fixed address, no employment, and a prior record of misdemeanor trespass. The state recommends continued detention until formal charges can be reviewed." It was all standard, until Judge Lane glanced down at the case file. At first it was just routine: name, age, arrest report. Then he saw the words Raymond Elias Cole. His eyes froze. He reread the name. Then again. His knuckles tightened around the file as a dull buzz started in the back of his mind, a flicker of recognition from a past long, buried under decades of civilian life. Could it be he turned to the property form, where the arresting officer had noted the presence of a military dog tag, worn nearly unreadable, but still inscribed with the name Cole R.E.? Michael Lane's breath caught in his throat. He looked up. Really looked for the first time. There he was, older, thinner, worn down by life, but unmistakably him, the same man who had once carried a bleeding medic 2 miles through enemy fire, the same man who had saved his life during a chaotic evacuation outside Fallujah, and now he sat in a courtroom in handcuffs on trial for a can of soup. The room around him blurred. He barely heard the prosecutor finish. Somewhere to his left, someone coughed. Another chuckled at the absurdity of the situation. But Judge Lane didn't laugh. His jaw clenched. A vein pulsed at his temple. He stood slowly rising from the bench, an action so rare in this setting that it immediately silenced the entire courtroom. People looked up surprised. The bailiff froze mid-step. Even the prosecutor stopped shuffling his papers. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, Judge Lane announced, his voice steady, but charged with something none of them could quite place. He didn't explain. He didn't offer a glance toward Cole. He just turned and walked out through the side door, past the chamber hallway, and into his private office, where the past had suddenly and violently caught up with him. Back in the courtroom, Raymond remained still. He didn't ask what was happening. He didn't wonder why the judge had looked at him like that, because some part of him already knew. Some part of him remembered shouting through smoke and blood, dragging a young man with a shredded leg, shouting, "Keep your eyes open. Stay with me." And now that man wore a robe and sat on the bench and had just stood for him. The heavy door to Judge Michael Lane's chambers clicked shut behind him. He stood in silence, staring at the floor, the name echoing again in his head like the aftermath of a gunshot. Raymond Cole. The office was quiet, decorated with certificates and degrees, but none of it felt important in that moment. Judge Lane moved slowly to the far cabinet and opened a narrow drawer labeled Service Archives. Most judges had law books or legal journals. Lane kept a different kind of file: faded clippings, old photographs, and military records, remnants of a life lived before the bench. He pulled out a black and white photograph, yellowing at the edges. A younger Lane than Private First Class Michael Lane, Army field medic, stood next to a sandbag wall. In the background, smoke, tense, chaos, war. But in the center of it all was a figure. He never forgot a tall, dark-eyed sergeant in dusty fatigues, dragging him through the dirt with one hand, rifle in the other, Cole. He still remembered the voice, deep calm under pressure. "You're not dying here, kid. Not today." He had never learned the man's full name. Cole never stayed for recognition, never filled out the after-action reports. He had disappeared back into duty like a ghost until now. Michael dropped into his chair and opened his laptop. He typed into the secure VA database he'd been given limited access to during his time volunteering for veteran legal clinics. He input the dog tag number from the arrest form. Match found. Name Raymond Elias Cole, DOB, April 2, 1956, Service Branch, United States Army rank, at discharge Sergeant First Class. Years of service 1976-2006, deployments Iraq X2, Afghanistan X1 medals, Bronze Star Army Commendation Medal, Good Conduct Medal X4, specialization, Tactical Logistics High-Risk Convoy Ops Emergency Extraction. Michael stared at the screen. This was no ordinary soldier. This was a man who had saved countless lives in silence and then faded without asking for anything in return. He scrolled further incident reports, mission logs, citations. One field report from Fallujah, July 2003, stopped him cold. Sergeant Cole diverted enemy fire from a downed medical unit by driving a damaged transport vehicle through active engagement zones. Sustained shrapnel to the leg and shoulder. Evacuated 2 injured medics under fire. One identified only as PFC-ML. Survived due to immediate extraction and aid. Michael exhaled, almost laughing. ML. Him. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of 20 years suddenly pressing on his chest. How many times had he replayed that day in his memory? The chaos, the fear, the voice. He had thought of his rescuer for years, sometimes wondering if he had imagined the whole thing. And now that man sat in his courtroom, charged with stealing a can of soup. Michael picked up his desk phone and called an old number 1 he hadn't dialed in over a decade. Colonel Thomas Raines, a gravelly voice answered. "Tom, it's Mike Lane." A pause. "Well, I'll be damned. Haven't heard from you since Fort Hood." "What's going on? I found him," Michael said quietly. "Who Cole?" "Raymond Cole. He's here, in Tucson. He's—" He stopped, ashamed to say the words. "He's homeless. He was arrested yesterday." Colonel Raines was silent for a long moment. "Raymond saved half a platoon at Fallujah, including you. He just disappeared. VA lost track of him after 2008. Michael's voice was low. "I owe him everything." "Do you still have that photo?" Raines asked. "I'm looking at it right now. I'll send you affidavits from the old unit. I'll call the Pentagon if I have to. Just don't let him slip through the cracks again, Mike." "I won't," Michael promised. Before hanging up, Raines added one last thing. "We all thought he was dead. Most heroes don't vanish unless they're broken." Michael sat in silence. Broken. That word lingered. He stared at Raymond's VA file. According to the system, his benefits were terminated in 2009 due to non-response to correspondence. The address on file hadn't been updated since before the economic crash. No disability filings. No pension withdrawals. No claims for mental health care. Nothing. It was as if the moment Raymond's wife passed and the country stopped needing him, he stopped existing. Michael printed the report and folded it neatly. He placed it into the court case file, State of Arizona versus Raymond Cole, and looked at it not as a judge, but as a man who had once been a scared, bleeding soldier on foreign soil, and who had been carried to safety by the very man now standing trial. It was time to make sure Raymond Cole was no longer forgotten. The gavel hadn't even fallen, but the energy in the courtroom had shifted. When Judge Michael Lane stepped back through the side door, he no longer looked like a man overseeing a petty theft case. He looked like someone who had just walked out of history, carrying with him a truth too heavy to leave in chambers. Everyone rose as he returned to the bench. But it wasn't just out of routine. Something in his face had changed. His jaw set tighter, his eyes sharper, more alert. He didn't glance at the prosecutor or the defense table. Instead, he looked directly at the man in handcuffs sitting quietly, head slightly bowed. Raymond Cole. "Court is back in session," the bailiff announced. Judge Lane didn't sit immediately. He stood behind the bench holding a file folder in his left hand, thicker than it had been when he left. "I have reviewed additional documentation regarding the defendant," he said, voice calm but commanding. "This information may significantly impact the direction of these proceedings." The young prosecutor blinked in confusion. "Your Honor, I wasn't informed of any. Lane held up a hand. You weren't. The documentation arrived during recess. He opened the folder slowly, deliberately. Before we proceed with any ruling, this court will first hear relevant testimony regarding the background of the defendant. There was a murmur in the audience. Testimony for a shoplifting case. The door at the rear of the courtroom opened quietly. All heads turned. 3 men entered in full military dress uniform, their posture rigid, their presence undeniable. One of them, a tall man with gray hair and 4 rows of commendations on his chest, approached the witness stand. Please state your name and rank for the record, Judge Lane said. Colonel Thomas Raines, U.S. Army, retired. And your relationship to the defendant? I served with Sergeant First Class Raymond Cole during multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Raines replied, I was his commanding officer. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Judge Lane leaned slightly forward. Colonel, you may proceed. Raines turned toward the gallery, speaking not just to the court, but to every soul in the room. This man, he said, motioning toward Raymond, once drove a burning Humvee through enemy fire to pull 3 wounded soldiers out of a kill zone. He sustained shrapnel injuries but refused evacuation until every last man was accounted for. He let the words hang. He did this not once but several times, and in one of those missions, he carried a young field medic bleeding unconscious over 2 miles to safety. That medic survived. His name was Michael Lane. The courtroom froze. All eyes turned to the judge. Judge Lane gave a single nod. That is correct. The weight of the revelation hit like thunder. Even Raymond lifted his head, stunned. Raines continued. For the past 15 years, Mr. Cole's military pension and benefits were suspended due to a bureaucratic error. He never received the assistance he was owed. No income, no housing, no mental health care, and he never once complained. The prosecutor slowly sat down. Judge Lane addressed the court, his voice gentler now. When I first saw Mr. Cole yesterday, I didn't recognize him. The war changes faces, but it does not erase sacrifice, and it does not excuse a nation from its debts. He turned toward Raymond. Mr. Cole, he said, will you please approach the bench? Raymond rose slowly, still shackled, moving like a man who couldn't quite believe this was real. You saved my life, the judge said, his voice trembling, just enough for those closest to hear. And this courtroom, this country owes you far more than it's given. He turned to the prosecutor. Do you wish to proceed with the charges? The young man swallowed. The state moves to dismiss your honor. With prejudice, so ordered, Judge Lane replied, lowering his gavel gently. All charges against Sergeant Raymond Cole are dismissed. The room didn't erupt into applause, it wouldn't have been proper, but something more profound happened. Silence, and then, one by one, people began to rise. Not because court was adjourned, but because they were in the presence of someone they had misjudged, a man they had walked past, forgotten, labeled, dismissed, and now finally they saw him, not as a thief, but as a soldier, as a hero. The courtroom remained still, the gavel's echo still fading into the corners of the chamber. Raymond Cole stood frozen near the bench wrists, still bound in cold metal. It was as if his body hadn't caught up with the moment, like he couldn't trust it was real. He'd spent so many years blending into sidewalks, dodging glances, and carrying the weight of silence that the sudden presence of attention, respect, even warmth felt unreal. A soft voice broke the quiet. Remove the cuffs, Judge Lane said. The bailiff hesitated only a second before stepping forward and unlocking the shackles. The steel dropped with a soft clink against the courtroom floor, quiet but thunderous in meaning. Raymond rubbed his wrists slowly. They were raw, not from the cuffs, but from years of tension he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Years of gripping plastic bags, trash bags, sleeping bags. Years of holding in grief, pain, and the memory of things no one ever asked him about. Mr. Cole, Judge Lane said again, but now with something else in his voice, humility. There's someone here who's been trying to find you. The rear courtroom doors opened once more. A woman in her 30s stepped inside, dressed plainly, but with urgency in her walk. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Raymond. Tears sprang to the surface instantly. Uncle Ray, she whispered. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing. Rebecca, his voice cracked. She nodded, already moving toward him. It had been over a decade since they'd seen each other, his late wife's niece, who had searched for him after Margaret's funeral after he'd vanished without a goodbye. She'd posted online called the VA searched shelters, but no one had known where he went, because Raymond didn't want to be found. But now standing before her, he looked like a man rising from the ashes of himself. She didn't hesitate. She embraced him tightly, her head against his chest, tears falling freely. Raymond didn't know how to hold her at first. His arms hovered for a moment. Then slowly they wrapped around her. For the first time in years, he wasn't holding on just to survive. He was holding on to someone who still remembered who he was. Behind them, another figure moved quietly through the crowd, Mr. Hernandez, the grocery store owner, the very man who had called the police. He stopped a few feet from Raymond, eyes lowered in shame. "I didn't see you," he said softly. "I just saw another problem, another person trying to take something." Raymond looked at him, not with anger, but with quiet understanding. "Most people don't," he replied. "It's all right." "No," Mr. Hernandez said, voice cracking. "It's not." He pulled something from his coat pocket, a handwritten note and a check. "We're setting up a fund to help other vets who've fallen through the cracks. In your name. I hope it's a start." Raymond looked down at the paper in disbelief. Not just a check, but something deeper: recognition. Within hours, news of the courtroom's reversal spread across local media and into national headlines. Homeless veteran cleared of charges after judge recognizes him as wartime hero. The photograph of Raymond standing beside the bench became the face of a national conversation. Donations flooded in. Veterans groups launched campaigns in his name. Former soldiers who had served under him began to surface, sharing stories long buried by time. But none of it compared to what happened the following week. At a veterans memorial ceremony in downtown Tucson, hundreds gathered: young recruits, Vietnam survivors, families of the fallen. As Judge Lane stood to speak, he paused mid-sentence and nodded toward the side entrance. The doors opened once again. Raymond Cole stepped in. This time no cuffs, no shame, no shadows. He wore a clean suit borrowed from a local foundation. His shoes still didn't fit right, but he walked tall, and as he approached the podium, every soldier in the crowd rose to their feet in silence. Back straight, hands to brows. A salute. Not ordered, not rehearsed, but earned. Raymond stood before them, no longer a ghost in the system, but a man who had returned. And this time the country was watching. It would have been easy for Raymond Cole to disappear again, to slip quietly into a small apartment offered by the VA to live out his days with food in the pantry and a roof overhead and let the world move on. After all, he had asked for nothing. Not the attention, not the applause, and certainly not the camera crews waiting outside his door. But something had changed, not just in the eyes of the people who now recognized him, but in him. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a problem, not as a burden, but as a man who still had something to offer. So Raymond chose a different path. He began speaking not to reporters, not to politicians, but to high school students, community centers, and veterans shelters. He didn't give speeches. He told stories, real ones. Stories about soldiers who came home to quiet battles, about friends who lost more than limbs, and about the silence that follows when a hero returns and nobody asks who he is anymore. "I don't tell these stories to get a reaction," he told a group of teens once. "I tell them because one day someone you love might come home from a war you'll never see. And when they do, they'll need more than a thank you." His voice wasn't theatrical. It was steady, lived in, and people listened. Soon, the city of Tucson did more than listen. With bipartisan support, the city council voted to establish the Raymond Cole Initiative, a fund dedicated to providing legal assistance, transitional housing, and mental health support for homeless veterans. The program's slogan came directly from a line in Raymond's first public statement: "Kindness isn't too late. It just needs someone patient enough to wait for it." The quote was etched in bronze outside the new Veteran Support Center, unveiled on Memorial Day with Raymond standing quietly in the crowd. He didn't want to cut any ribbons. He didn't want to speak from a podium. He just stood with his hands behind his back, watching as young cadets raised the American flag in front of a crowd that now knew his name. Inside the center, a hallway was dedicated to memory, not just his, but those like him. Framed photos lined the walls: Raymond carrying wounded soldiers, his late wife Margaret smiling on their wedding day, and snapshots of other veterans who had vanished into America's forgotten corners. One photo placed right at the entrance stood out. It was of a judge in black robes shaking hands with an older man in a wrinkled coat. No caption, no explanation, because by now everyone knew who they were. In the months that followed, Raymond stayed in Tucson. He had family now. His niece Rebecca visited often, and neighbors would stop by to bring groceries or just sit and listen. He still took evening walks by himself, and some nights when the air cooled and the stars came out, he'd flip open that old Zippo lighter, hold it to the sky and smile. Not because he missed the battlefield, but because somehow he'd won a different kind of war. One not marked by explosions or gunfire, but by the quiet reclaiming of dignity. And by the return of something most people never realize: they've lost a place in the world where their name means something again. In a world that moves faster every day, stories like Raymond Cole's remind us to slow down and look twice. How many people do we walk past each week without truly seeing them? A man on a bench, a woman pushing a cart, someone digging through a bin. What if behind those eyes is a history of service, sacrifice, and silent strength? Raymond didn't ask for pity. He asked for nothing at all. But dignity doesn't need to be asked for, it should be freely given. That's what this story's about. Not just a courtroom twist or a surprise hero reveal, but a mirror to our own lives. Who have we forgotten? And more importantly, what can we do now to remember them? If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever misjudged someone at first glance? Do you believe America is doing enough for its veterans? Or have you personally known someone who served and was forgotten? Let's open that conversation in the comments below. We can't rewrite the past, but we can shape how we treat one another moving forward. Thank you for listening to Raymond's Journey. If you found value in this story, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who still believes in the power of decency, justice, and second chances. Because sometimes the quietest people have the loudest truths, and all they need is someone willing to listen.